Hey everyone, my name is Duncan Epping and I'm a Chief Technologist working for VMware in the Cloud Platform Business Unit. Today I'm presenting another webinar and today I'll be focusing primarily on what has been released with vSAN 7.0 Update 1 and how this can make your life easier, not just as an administrator, but potentially also to provide new services to your business. As you've already probably heard, over the last couple of years, there's been this major shift in the industry where we see a lot of new types of applications popping up. This, of course, also has an impact on you as the administrator because it will mean that those applications will need to be not only provisioned, but also administered and potentially also protected using the various different types of disaster recovery solutions. IDC has actually done some calculations, and IDC has calculated that in the upcoming 5 years, you as the administrator will be deploying more applications and solutions and services than you have done so in the past 4 years. Now, if you think back to the last 10 years or so, and you look back at the amount of work that you've done and the amount of applications that you have deployed, just imagine that this now all of a sudden triples or quadruples. You can imagine that the amount of work that you're supposed to be doing also greatly expands. Not only that, the big challenge, of course, here is the following. In the majority of cases, your management will expect you to manage more applications with the exact same amount of people. Of course, the amount of resources from a compute perspective and a storage perspective probably will go up, but the amount of people actually managing those applications will most likely not increase. And that, of course, imposes a couple of challenges. Because in a lot of cases, the infrastructure being used to deploy these new services on are not really ready to deploy these types of services on. The majority of you are probably still using traditional data centers, and as we all know, traditional data centers today are not able to keep up with the demands of the newer type of applications that we are deploying. Not only are traditional data centers far too complex to be agile enough to provision these newer types of applications, on top of that, they're also rather inefficient, which will drive up the cost. Plus, they're also relatively slow, and all of those different factors combined now will also introduce a risk. Not just a risk from an IT point of view, but also, of course, a risk from a business perspective, because it may result in the fact of you being too late to market when it comes to providing newer services to your customers, which in the end could result up in the business ending up losing customers. And this is something, of course, that you should be able to try to avoid at all costs. Now, if you look at the different infrastructures being deployed out there, and we've always been talking about these different types of layers, and in the majority of cases, we always come back to these 3 layers. And I know many people have said that we need to get away from these 3-layer cakes where we have networking, storage, and compute, or potentially a database, a front-end server, and a middleware server. But in the end, it all comes back down to these 3 layers. Even when we are talking about cloud-native applications, these cloud-native applications typically will need to land on top of something. Now, if you look at it from a developer perspective, and we have these Kubernetes clusters running on top of your vSphere environments, those Kubernetes clusters actually end up running on the layer that we refer to as vSphere with Tanzu. vSphere with Tanzu, of course, is our Kubernetes offering, which basically allows you or enables you to quickly instantiate these Tanzu Kubernetes guest clusters. Now, that, of course, also needs to run on top of a physical infrastructure. And that is the layer that I'm going to be primarily focusing on. I'm not going to be talking about the physical components as much, but my focus is going to be on all of the different software aspects that run directly on top of those physical components that will enable you to actually start delivering the services that we see at the top of this diagram. So Tanzu, Kubernetes, grid clusters, or Kubernetes pods in general. Now, as you hopefully all know, we've had this HCI solution for the last couple of years. Actually, we started out in 2013 with a beta release of what we refer to as our core HCI platform, vSAN plus vSphere. And then in 2014, we had our very first general availability release, our GA release. Quickly after that, we actually followed up with a full stack HCI offering, which is what we refer to in this particular case as VMware Cloud Foundation. That is the product name for our full stack HCI offering. Now, the main difference, of course, being between our full stack offering and our core HCI offering is the fact that for our full stack HCI offering, it also comes included with our networking and security components being VMware NSX. On top of that, it also provides a lot of additional capabilities that will enable you to quickly, for instance, instantiate a Kubernetes cluster on top of our HCI platform, or for instance, potentially something like VDI, or maybe you would like even to deploy vRealize services or integrate all of these different vRealize components into the exact same platform. The last thing that I want to mention when it comes to HCI being a foundation element of private and public clouds is that this platform is actually being used by a lot of public clouds out there to provide these VMware services to you as a customer. So if you look at, for instance, VMware Cloud on AWS, or potentially the Azure platform or the Google Cloud platform, a lot of these services actually consume VMware Cloud Foundation as their base layer for providing VMware services to their customers. Now, as you hopefully all are aware, vSAN is an enterprise storage solution, and it doesn't only provide you traditional block storage, but on top of that, it also provides you file storage, and it also enables you to run these cloud native applications. Now, the key thing here, in my opinion, is the fact that we actually enable you to run all of these different types of workloads on a single platform. Not only do you have a single platform, but you also have a single management tool through vCenter Server that enables you to manage all of these different types of workloads. Now, the other thing which I think is key when it comes to vSAN itself, but not just to vSAN, also to virtual volumes, is the way that you end up managing all of these different entities that end up running on top of the platform. Not only your virtual machines are managed through policy, but also, for instance, file shares are managed through policies, and of course all of the container workloads that may end up running on top of your vSAN cluster or your virtual volumes cluster are also managed by policies. In these policies, you will define what the capabilities should be for your virtual machine, how the virtual machine should be protected. For instance, for virtual volumes, you can specify if the virtual machine needs to be replicated between locations, for instance. And for vSAN, for instance, you can specify more or less what the performance capability should look like, or what the availability aspects of a virtual machine should be, whether it's RAID 1 versus RAID 5, or potentially even RAID 6. All of those different capabilities can be configured leveraging policy-based management. Now, not only do we provide you the ability to specify what capability should be enabled, that of course also in the back end of the system itself results in the way the data is being distributed across the cluster. So in this particular example, you see a virtual machine or a virtual disk which has been configured with a RAID 1 configuration, which means that from a storage placement perspective, you will get 2 copies of the data and a witness component. And of course, depending on all of the different options that you specified within the policy, vSAN will now automatically take care of not only the placement of the virtual machines, but of course also the number of copies that you will have of the data, and that in the end determines the availability of the workloads that run on top of vSAN. And I think that is something which is truly unique when it comes to the vSAN platform. Now, besides having the ability to specify what a virtual machine should look like or how a virtual machine should perform through policy, you probably will also want to have the ability to specify which kind of data services should be enabled on a particular data store and which shouldn't be enabled. If you look at the long list of the various different data services that we have available, I think it's safe to say that we actually have all of the different data services available that you would expect from any enterprise storage solution. One of the things that I want to point out though is that in the vSAN 7.0 Update 1 release, we actually introduced 2 additional data services. Besides having the ability to enable deduplication and compression for your full cluster, we now also provide the ability to only enable compression for your vSAN data store. On top of that, and this is something that a lot of you actually have requested, besides having data at rest encryption, we now also provide the ability to have data in transit encryption. So if you have requirements for your workloads to be encrypted not only at rest but also for data in transit, so as soon as it leaves the virtual machine and it travels over the network to those different physical devices, you now also have that ability available within vSAN. Now, as I've already mentioned, all of these data services can be enabled on a cluster level, so this is enabled for your vSAN data store itself and not on a per virtual machine basis. So that is slightly different to what we've seen in the previous slides. Now, one of the other things which I think is truly unique about vSAN is the way that we provide the ability to not only scale up, so you can easily add additional devices per vSAN host, which would potentially allow you to add additional virtual machines, but we also provide you the ability to easily scale out by adding additional hosts to the cluster with potentially additional SSDs or maybe magnetic disks, which then allows you also to grow the vSAN data store in a fully automated fashion. I think that is something that stands out from an agility perspective, how easy vSAN is to consume and to use and to expand. Now, when it comes to vSAN itself, and I've already mentioned this a couple of times, we recently had to release the vSAN 7.0 Update 1, and there were a couple of really cool enhancements as part of vSAN 7.0 Update 1. I'm not going to mention all of them specifically in this particular webinar, because that would mean the webinar would probably take at least 2.5 hours, but I want to quickly go over a couple which I think are extremely important to understand and to know about. I've listed a few of them here, but I've got a couple of slides that I actually want to show you, which will go a lot more in depth about these particular services. And the first aspect that I want to address is the extension of file services itself. In vSAN 7.0, we've already released the ability to create file shares, and these file shares revolved all around the NFS protocol. Starting vSAN 7.0 Update 1, we now also provide the ability to create SMB shares. So if you're one of those customers that, for instance, has a Windows platform and you would prefer to use the SMB protocol, starting with 7.0 Update 1, we now provide that ability as well. On top of that, starting 7.0 Update 1, we also provide the ability to do authentication for not only NFS as well as SMB through Kerberos and Active Directory. And I also think that is something that a majority of you will truly appreciate. Now, having said that, and I've discussed vSAN file services during one of the previous sessions as well, I think it is good to understand what some of the use cases are for these solutions. I've already started talking about cloud native workloads and how the world of cloud native applications is slowly changing the infrastructure landscape, and of course that also applies to us as vSAN evangelists, right? In a lot of cases, when we start talking about these cloud native workloads, the question that also comes in next then is, how can we actually store volumes for our cloud native workloads on top of vSAN? You could potentially use vSAN, the cloud native storage control plane, with the block aspect for that, but of course you also have the ability to start leveraging the file share capability that we've now introduced as part of 7.0 and 7.0 Update 1. And I think that is something that provides not only a lot of flexibility, hopefully a lot of agility as well for your developers. Now, if you look at the solution, how it has been implemented, because I think this is something that is important to understand, because it is rather unique compared to the traditional vSAN solution. Although it's fully integrated as part of the vSAN management plane, if you look at it from a implementation or architectural perspective, it slightly looks different than what you may have seen before. If you look at it from the top down and you have an NFS client or an SMB client connecting to an NFS or SMB server, you will see, or you will end up seeing, multiple of these NFS servers running for resiliency purposes, of course, in your environment. These NFS services actually sit on top of the ESXi host, so they're not a kernel module that is part of ESXi itself, but they actually reside within a file services virtual machine. Now, they are instantiated as a container, so we have these protocol stack container units running in every single file services virtual machine, and you will see up to 32 of these protocol stack containers running in your environment. As soon as you start creating a file share, the interesting part here, of course, is the following. You can assign a policy with it, and of course, then vSAN will take care of the placement of the data. So you as an administrator are not responsible for taking care of that. The other thing which I think is important to understand is that those file services virtual machines and those protocol stack containers are also installed and configured by vSAN and ESX Agent Manager. The ESX Agent Manager is actually responsible for managing those virtual machines and managing the containers that run within those virtual machines. On top of that, the other thing that I think is important to understand when it comes to vSAN file services is that the file services virtual machines actually will have affinity with a host. So if one of the hosts would fail, you will see that the file services virtual machine is going to be impacted, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your file services solution is going to be impacted, because of course, from an availability perspective, availability actually happens on a container level. So it doesn't happen on the virtual machine level, but it actually happens on the container level. And I think that is also something that is truly unique about this implementation. Now you may wonder, why did we actually implement it using these file services, virtual machines, and these containers? Well, you can imagine that if we would introduce additional kernel modules, it would potentially be more challenging to start introducing additional protocols, because we potentially would need to do a lot of additional testing for introducing these new capabilities at that particular layer. When we introduce this solution as a file services virtual machine that actually has a container running inside with NFS or potentially SMB, and now all of a sudden becomes a lot easier for us to start introducing these changes. The cool thing about the solution though is that from a performance perspective, and from a manageability standpoint, it still behaves the exact same way you would expect it to behave. It just behaves like regular vSAN. Not only does it perform extremely well, it is also extremely easy to manage. From a performance standpoint, of course, these file services virtual machines actually use the vSocket API, so a VMCI interface, which is basically a PCIe interface within the virtual machine that is capable of directly communicating with the vSAN kernel modules. So from an efficiency perspective, it is highly efficient. Now, as I mentioned, the virtual machines are being managed by ESX Agent Manager. And if you're interested in what that looks like, I can actually show you that in this demo. Now, if you look at the screen, we already have a vSAN cluster up and running. We have a significant number of hosts in our environment, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to look at the file services configuration. I already have it configured, but if you would normally click enable, this is the screen that would pop up. You will need to fill out the file service domain, the DNS server, the DNS suffix. Of course, if you would like to integrate it with Active Directory, you will need to specify the Active Directory domain name, and of course, you will need to specify an AD username as well. On top of that, you will need to make sure that the services are connected to a network, so you select a port group, and you will need to start specifying the IP details. You would also need to specify the IP pool, and these IP addresses that you specify will actually be associated with the container. On top of that, you will also need to have DNS names, of course, available for this service. After you then click Next, Next, Finish, vSAN file services is going to be enabled. Now, after you've enabled it, of course, you can start creating these file shares. When you click on Add, you can simply provide a name for a new file share, and then you can select the protocol that you would like to use for this file share. That can be, as mentioned, SMB or NFS. For SMB, you can enable protocol encryption. You can simply select the policy that you would like to use, and then, of course, you can specify the quota. On top of that, you can also add labels to each of the file shares. So if you would like to filter at a later date for a particular set of file shares, you can start doing that as well. When you click Next, Next, Finish, the file share is going to be created, and then, of course, the file share can be consumed by you as an administrator, or maybe potentially by one of your users. Now, if you would like to provide the URL to one of your users, you can simply select the file share and do copy path NFS v3 or 41. We could do the same thing for SMB, but on top of that, we can also copy the MMC command, so the Microsoft Management Console command, which allows us to manage, for instance, the permissions. The other thing that we can do in this interface is we can actually look at the detailed view of the file share where the data is being stored. And not only that, we can also see how it's been performing. We can see the throughput, we can see the number of IOPS, or we can see the latency. And of course, we can also click on View Performance to get even more details. Not just more details, we can also go back to a particular time range or look at the last 6 hours, for instance, for our file share to see how it has been behaving. Not only can I look at my NFS performance, but I can also look at the file system performance as well, the VMware Virtual Distributed File System. On top of that, we've also included additional information in the capacity overviews around the vSAN file shares. And of course, we also added additional Skyline health checks. So for instance, if one of your users is consuming an excess amount of capacity and you specify that as a threshold, all of that information now bubbles up in the Skyline health as well as being called out. So you can have a conversation with one of the consumers of those file shares. Besides, of course, vSAN file services, which I think is probably one of the larger features that we released as part of 7.0. There are a couple of other things that we released as part of 7.0 Update 1 as well. One of the other capabilities, which I think a lot of you will appreciate, is HCI Mesh. So what is HCI Mesh? You may have already heard the name popping up here and there, but HCI Mesh basically allows you to mount a vSAN data store from one vSAN data store to the other vSAN data store. So if you have a vSAN cluster that doesn't have sufficient capacity, or you have multiple vSAN clusters that don't have sufficient capacity, you can now mount a vSAN data store which may still have loads of capacity available, which not only then allows you to provision a virtual machine on that remote data store, but it will also allow you to move that virtual machine around between one cluster and the other cluster using a regular vMotion process. So not a storage vMotion process, but that would be a regular vMotion process. And that is something that we've also introduced as part of vSAN 7.0 Update 1. Now, I do want to point out that today, in the very first version, you can only leverage this capability when all of the clusters that end up consuming that data store also have vSAN enabled and will have a local vSAN data store. So that is something that I think is important to understand. So both on the local cluster and the remote cluster, vSAN needs to be enabled and you will need to have a vSAN data store running. Plus it requires the vSAN Enterprise license for all of the hosts in that cluster as well. So that is something that I think that is important to understand. So what does it look like? Well, I actually created a demo that shows you how we can simply mount a vSAN data store. In this particular case, I have two clusters, a hybrid cluster, and I have an all-flash environment as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount the all-flash data store in my hybrid cluster, because this is also something that we support. So if you have a virtual machine sitting in your hybrid cluster, which for whatever reason needs to consume all flash capacity, you can simply do so by mounting the vSAN data store. As you just noticed, we simply need to select the vSAN data store. When we click next, next, finish, all of the hosts within the cluster now will have that vSAN data store mounted. And when you provision a virtual machine, of course, you can simply now start selecting the data store that virtual machine needs to be provisioned on. So we select the right cluster. In this particular case, I will need to select the host as well. And after I've selected the host, I can now select the data store. I could either select, for instance, a RAID 5 or a RAID 6 configuration, because that is what the all-flash cluster is capable of. In this particular case, I'm just selecting the vSAN default data store policy, and I'm just going to provision the virtual machine so you can see that it actually does work. So after the virtual machine has provisioned, of course, we're also providing additional operational guidance, because you will need to figure out at some point in time where the virtual machine is running. So when you click the virtual machine and you go to monitor and you go to the physical disk placement, you will now see that this virtual machine is actually placed on a remote data store. So it actually calls that out. Not just that, also from a policy perspective, it will tell you that this is actually, from an accessibility point of view, a virtual machine that is remote accessed. So it's accessed through a remote data store, in this particular case, the all-flash data store. Now, I've already mentioned this in the very first release, all of the hosts in the cluster, and all of the clusters need to be enabled with vSAN and need to have a local vSAN data store as well. But for the future release, what we are planning for is providing you the ability to also expose vSAN storage to a vSAN or to a cluster that doesn't necessarily have vSAN enabled, but will only be running the vSAN client. Now, I can't mention when or even if this will be available, but this is definitely something that we are considering for the next phase of HCI Mesh. Not only that, you may have also heard about these smart NICs that keep on popping up. VMware actually has spoken about Project Monterey at VMworld not too long ago, and what we will expect in the future as well, that we can start leveraging this smart NIC technology to basically enable customers to start mounting the vSAN data store not only on remote compute only clusters, but potentially even physical machines. So you can imagine you have a physical Windows or a physical Linux machine, which now will have the ability to start leveraging vSAN storage. Now, all of these capabilities, of course, that I'm now just talking about is something that we are considering for future releases. It's not even something that we are actively working on. So this is just a vision. It's not necessarily something that will be released in the upcoming future. Now, besides providing the ability to mount remote data stores, we also introduced a couple of enhancements from an operational perspective when it comes to leveraging capacity in a more efficient way. In the past, we've also always told customers that they should probably reserve around 30% in terms of spare capacity just in case a host fails, or also for vSAN internal reasons from an operational perspective. And one of the things that we're introducing as part of vSAN 7.0 Update 1 is the ability to specify that vSAN automatically needs to reserve capacity for vSAN internal operations. And on top of that, you can also specify that you would like to reserve capacity for a host rebuild. So if a host fails and the components will need to be rebuilt, you can start setting aside resources for that as well. Very similar to what you will do with vSphere HA and Mission Control. Now, as you can see on the screen, from a capacity standpoint, that can save a massive amount of capacity, because traditionally, as I mentioned, we would say set aside 30%, but the larger the cluster is, as listed here, a 12-node cluster, you will get away with around roughly 18% worth of capacity that is set aside. But if you have a 24-node cluster, that 18% all of a sudden drops down to 14%. And if you have an even larger cluster, it actually drops down to 12%. So from a capacity standpoint, there's a lot of reasons for enabling this capability. On top of that, why I also feel is very valuable is the fact that this is something that is set aside automatically by vSAN itself. So you as an administrator don't necessarily need to constantly monitor what is happening from a capacity standpoint. Now, one of the other things that we've introduced, which will make life a lot easier when it comes to scaling and managing an environment, in my opinion, is the fact that we now provide you the ability, when you have multiple 2-node configurations, to share the witness node that you've deployed. So in the past, when you've created a 2-node configuration, you need to have a dedicated witness appliance, or potentially a physical cluster as well, or physical host as well, allocated to that 2-node configuration. Starting vSAN 7.0 Update 1, we now provide the ability to connect 64 2-node clusters with a single witness appliance. So if you're running that witness appliance and you're running multiple different locations, and for instance you have 16 locations, you can now connect all of those 16 locations back to that single vSAN witness appliance. And this will reduce the operational and technical overhead, not just from a management standpoint, but of course also when you need to do some of the different types of day 2 operations like updates or upgrades. A couple of other things that we've introduced, which I think are very valuable to understand, are some of the performance enhancements as part of vSAN 7.0 Update 1. Some of the performance enhancements were already introduced as part of vSAN 7.0, but others were introduced specifically for vSAN 7.0 Update 1. I've already mentioned that there's a big benefit in terms of enabling compression only compared to deduplication and compression, but we've also introduced a lot of performance enhancements for deduplication and compression. So we've seen a significant performance increase for deduplication and compression itself. On top of that, one of the other things that we've introduced from a networking perspective is the ability to receive multiple threads, and this is something that will greatly improve performance. I actually had one of our customers reaching out not too long ago, and actually mentioned that they saw a significant performance increase as a result of this particular feature. It's not a feature that we've called out publicly too often so far. If you look back at the release notes, it is mentioned, but it's only a single item, and that's one of the reasons this customer actually came back to me. They asked me specifically if we made any enhancements from a networking standpoint, because they saw such a massive performance increase. Now, from an operational perspective, of course, there's also a couple of things that we introduced. Not only does this make maintenance mode a lot easier, it also improves performance when it comes to maintenance mode as well. So what am I talking about specifically? Well, this is something that internally we've referred to as Delta components so far. And basically what this provides is the ability to, when you place a host in maintenance mode, is to have new writes actually being written to a Delta component. So if we place a host in maintenance mode, and as a result that data becomes inaccessible, and in this particular case we're not moving out the data just remains on the host, so we're using the ensure accessibility option, or the option where we're not moving data, we now create an additional component. That can only be created if you have sufficient hosts in your environment. But assuming you have sufficient hosts in your environment, that Delta component will now start receiving additional IOs. Now, the great benefit of this, of course, is when you go out of maintenance mode, it actually provides us the ability to, not only from an availability standpoint, ensure that that replica that was in maintenance mode can now be brought up to the same level as the level that the failed host potentially was at, but also if a host hasn't failed, it will also improve the time that it will take to actually merge the data, because we have those Delta components sitting there in a second host. The other thing that I think a lot of you will find valuable when it comes to the operational aspect and maintenance mode is the fact that we've actually improved the restart process. We've now added the ability for vSAN to actually dump all of the in-memory metadata tables to disk or to the caching layer, and upon a restart actually read it from cache as well. And that greatly improves the time that it takes to restart hosts within an environment. The other thing that from an operational perspective you may find interesting is the new ability that we've added to vSAN 7.0 Update 1 to actually analyze virtual machine I/O metrics. So we've added something to vSAN 7.0 Update 1, which is called vSAN I/O Insight. I've spoken about that a couple of times before at a previous webinars actually, and I've showed you a couple of demos as well. And the great thing about this particular solution is that it allows you to enable on a per virtual machine basis if that virtual machine needs to be analyzed from an I/O standpoint. As soon as you've enabled it for a virtual machine, we're going to track that virtual machine or multiple virtual machines, and then after the time has elapsed that you've specified, we will provide you all the information around that particular virtual machine. Now, you may wonder what that looks like, and I've actually created a demo because I think it's important to understand. Now, I have two clusters here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to enable it on one of my clusters. On the first cluster, I'm actually not able of enabling it, and it's for the very simple reason that I haven't enabled the vSAN performance monitoring option. So if you have the vSAN performance monitoring option enabled, you will actually have this new option called new I/O Insight instance on a virtual machine level or on a cluster level as well, and then you can simply start managing or simply start monitoring your virtual machines. You can specify the duration, so anywhere between 1 minute and 24 hours, and after you've done that, we're going to monitor that virtual machine or the set of virtual machines for the amount of time that you specified. After the time is elapsed, of course, what is going to happen is that all of the data is now going to be shown in the monitoring section, and specifically, of course, in the performance section. We added a new option called I/O Insight, and that will now list all of the virtual machines or set of virtual machines that you've monitored. As soon as you've click on one of those, so you do view metrics, you will now will start seeing all of the information that we provide. Anything from IOPS to I/O size distribution, I/O latency, throughput, basically anything you would like to know from a virtual machine standpoint. Now, from a futures perspective, there are a couple of things that we are still considering and that we are working on. Of course, we do feel that having that analytics aspect for a virtual machine is very important. So having the ability to specify that a number of virtual machines will need to be analyzed is very important. But on top of that, we also feel that you should have the ability to then see not just what the data looks like from a graph perspective, but potentially even have some form of diagram that shows you the path of a virtual machine or an application down all the way to the disk. And if there's any form of latency, we will also provide you a breakdown of that latency as well. So you can imagine that, for instance, there's some form of network latency, or potentially there's a caching tier that is having some form of bottleneck, some form of issue, or maybe even a capacity tier. All of that information should pop up in the UI as well in the future. And that is something that we're also planning on providing. Then last but not least, one of the new solutions that went into GA as well is vRealize AI, so artificial intelligence. And leveraging the vRealize SaaS platform, we will provide you additional insights, and not only just insights in what is happening in your environment, but vRealize AI also will provide the capability to automatically start making changes to your environment to ensure that it's optimized for your workloads as well. Not only will it monitor your environment, it will take that data, feed it back into the SaaS platform, our data lake platform, and then it will start taking action based on machine learning algorithms. So the machine learning algorithm will figure out what is happening in your environment, and we'll try to figure out how it should be optimized to ensure your workloads run as efficient as they can run. So this is something that should be available for you today. I do want to point out that it's a SaaS platform, so your environment should be connected to the internet in some shape or form. And hopefully this is something that will interest you. And then last but not least, before we wrap it up, I would like to introduce VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. In my opinion, it's probably one of the coolest solutions that we've released over the past couple of years. It basically provides a very cost-efficient way of protecting business-critical workloads and recovering them into a cloud platform. Now, you may ask yourself why we are doing this and why we actually decided to acquire Datrium, and it's fairly straightforward. Whenever we would have a discussion with IT organizations, a lot of customers would tell us the exact same thing. Not only would they tell us that DR is extremely complex to set up and manage, it would also be relatively expensive. And of course, the majority of IT organizations would tell us the same thing. We're not capable of adding additional IT headcount for every single service that we are adding. The other thing that came back fairly often is customers would mention to us that they wouldn't have multiple locations, so they weren't even physically capable of creating this disaster recovery site. But on top of that, also testing disaster recovery would be disruptive even if they would have, or in majority of cases could be disruptive, even if they had multiple locations. And this is one of the reasons VMware acquired Datrium, and this is exactly what VMware Cloud DR provides to you. VMware Cloud DR provides the ability to protect any workload and replicate that workload into object storage within VMware Cloud on AWS, and then recover that particular workload as well again into VMware Cloud on AWS. And of course, you can also move it back over time. So if there's a requirement to move that workload or replicate that workload back from the cloud into on-premises, VMware Cloud DR also provides that capability. Now, the one thing that I do want to point out, and I realize that the majority of people here are from the European region, we do have this offering available in select regions today. For Europe specifically, we're talking about London and Frankfurt. Of course, we're looking to expand those different regions to various countries throughout Europe and of course throughout the world. So this is something that we're definitely working towards. We're planning on expanding these targeted regions fairly soon. And with that, we've started to reach the end of the session. I would like to thank everyone for watching. Hopefully it has been useful, and hopefully I've been able to show you not only what is available as part of vSAN 7.0 Update 1 and how vSAN plays a critical role as part of the future of the SDDC, but also been able to provide you some additional information around what you can expect in the near future and how you can potentially connect your on-premises environment to a public cloud. Thanks for watching. Feel free to connect to me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I hope to see you next time.